All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 28th Annual UWSP Teaching Conference. My name is Erin Speetson. I'm the Director for the Center for Inclusive Teaching and Learning and a Professor of Chemistry. On behalf of the entire CITL staff, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us for a day of learning, sharing, and connecting. We have some amazing presentations scheduled for today, and my sincere hope is that each of us walks away from today inspired and ready to start classes next week. To kick off our conference, I am thrilled to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Sarah Cavanaugh. Dr. Cavanaugh is a psychologist, professor, and senior associate director for teaching and learning at Simmons University, where she teaches classes on affective science and mental health, researches the intersections of emotion, motivation, and learning, and provides educational development for faculty. She gives keynote addresses and workshops at a variety of colleges and national and international conferences, blogs for Psychology Today, and writes essays for venues like LitHub and the Chronicles of Higher Education. Her book, Mind Over Monsters, looks into the mental health crisis affecting young adults today and argues for creating learning environments characterized by compassion and guiding our youth into practices that help them face their fears in an encouraging and safe way. Before I turn it over to Dr. Cavanaugh, one practical note about the keynote for our in-person attendees. You'll find some notepads and pencils at your tables. If you have questions for Dr. Cavanaugh, please write them down. A CITL staff member will collect them and bring them over to me. I'll enter them into chat for Dr. Cavanaugh. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our keynote speaker.
Thank you so much, Erin. And can everyone hear me okay? I'm going to share and great, thank you. I'm going to start up here. And then one more thing, I just want to make sure I can see the chat so I can see what's happening with our friends on Zoom. So it's lovely to be here today with you this morning. I always take more from these tables, I feel like, than I bring to them, the conversations, the discussions, the questions. And so I really value your participation this morning. I also really love doing these kinds of events at the start of a semester because I think as taxed as we all are over the whole year, each new semester still brings that little juice, that little verve of energy. And I love kicking off new semesters with my own faculty at Simmons and talking to faculty on other campuses. So I really thank you for being here and sharing your energy and your ideas with me. I've posted in the chat for the Zoom folks, and I hope that you have received or will receive from the organizers a link that contains a folder that has a copy of all these slides. And just a note, if you go to see the slides, don't view them in presentation mode because all of the notes parts at the bottom have links to any of the articles, the books, and some other resources that I'm going to recommend, so you can follow up on those later. I also have included 2 resource guides that you're welcome to use and share. So I wanted to start out with a question, and Zoom friends can post this in the chat, and maybe the folks in the room can just say out loud. I would like to hear how you are feeling about this new semester. So it sounds like classes start next week. Are you feeling like this owl, giving the semester a little bit of a side eye? Are you charging into the semester like the horse? Or you just want to curl up under the covers? So how is everyone feeling? I hear an owl. Okay, so we're like I got another owl in the Zoom chat. Do we have any chargers into the semester? A couple horses. Okay, I got a horse in the chat. All right, well, thank you very much for sharing that with me. Ooh, we have a cat. Someone's pulling the covers over their head. And I just like to hear how we're feeling, get a read of the room, even though I am not in the room with you. And I think that we're in a kind of an interesting moment in higher education, a time of transitions and yet another transition time and a time of so many transitions. And these are some images from a favorite Twitter follow of mine back when Twitter was reasonable. And the Twitter account is called Space Liminal Bot. And it's an account that posts images that the account holder feels are liminal, that are infused with an eerie sense of beginnings, endings, transitions, and new possibilities. And so all the way on the left, we have a school corridor at night. Looks kind of abandoned, but there's a traffic cone holding the door open for someone. And in the middle image, we have a beach scene at night, which is pleasant, but the sign is askew, following possible drama. And in my favorite one, all the way on the right, we have another night scene, and it's traffic lights. And somehow we're being given all three messages at once. We're being told stop, we're being told go, we're being told slow down. And I think that this is representative of where we are in higher education at the moment. We're getting a lot of messages, there's been a lot of transitions, and we're at this moment, this possible tipping point. And I do feel like this moment is infused with possibility to reset, to reach a greater equilibrium, to take lessons from the past, to return to some things that were working that we had to abandon because of the pandemic, but to leave behind some things that should have been left in the past all along. And so I really look forward to this conversation today. And as you heard, some of the evidence that I'm going to present to you today was gathered in the process of writing my most recent book, Mind Over Monsters. And so you're going to hear some voices of our students. We did a qualitative interview study of 35 students across the country, very different types of institutions, about their hopes, their dreams, their emotions, and learning. Certainly dug into the latest psychological, neuroscientific, and educational literature for some insights into how we can help support students and faculty. And then I also engaged in some expert interviewers with educators, clinicians, psychologists, and even acting coaches. And so you're going to see this evidence threaded throughout today. And this is the structure for our time together. I want to talk a little bit about problems. As you probably can tell already, I'm kind of an optimistic person. And so this will be the shortest part of the talk. I think we're also all familiar with the challenges that face us, but I do think that we need a little bit of that context in order to get started. I'm going to dig into that science that we talked about in those expert interviews and some of the insights of our students. And then I really want to spend a bunch of time talking about solutions. And so we're going to start here. And so the friends on Zoom, you can do kind of a quiet reflection and feel free to chat together in the chat. In the room, if you could chat together at tables a little bit. I would like you to talk a little bit about what are the challenges that our students are facing right now. And in the book, I use the metaphorical frame of monsters. Monsters are uncontrollable. They feel ruthless and unmanageable. They evoke reactions of fear and uncertainty, and they inspire avoidance. So they're intimidating and we shrink from them. And so I'd like you to talk for just a few minutes. What current challenges are students bringing to our classroom that are uncontrollable, terrifying, and intimidating? So go ahead and have a chat. All right, if we could gather back together, I can tell you some of the things that are popping up in the chat, and it sounds like the preferred approach of the room and the organizers is if you write on the little slips of paper, and Erin will post in the chat your responses. So in the chat, we have some inability to focus, trouble with distractions and challenges in terms of attention. We have balancing school with obligations, right? Parents, younger siblings. A lot of our students are working, many more students than in the past. Economic and family stress, mental health, lack of scheduling and organizational practice. We have more attention to financial issues and working part-time to pay the tuition. And so these are some of the things that may have come up at the tables as well. And what often comes up in my conversations with faculty, I think can be categorized or kind of binned into time frames, right? And so we have the difficult things that have happened to students in the past, things that students are bringing to the classroom from their past experiences. And so this is everything from trauma, adverse childhood experiences, experiences with discrimination, racism, and inequality. So our students are coming to us with these difficult pasts. A lot of them, and this seems to be the theme of what is in the chat, is stress in the present, right? Lack of sleep, nutrition, exercise, housing, scheduling regularity, leisure activities. We saw all of these in your contributions. And when we start talking about solutions, we'll start talking about this need for a network of supportive acquaintances and mentors and friends and family. And then the future, right? The precarious future, the unknown. And students really often struggle with uncertainty tolerance, right? They have trouble tolerating that uncertainty. They sometimes have lack of clear direction. And even our wealthy students, I think, have this perceived scarcity of resources and precarity of their position. It feels like you take the wrong step and you could lose everything. And so in a way, students have always come to us with difficult pasts, stressful presents, precarious futures. This is part of the human condition. And those of us, including myself, who have been teaching for quite a long time, this has been true through generations. But I think, and I didn't see so much of this in the chat, but maybe you discussed this at the tables, I think that students coming to the classroom today have all of these difficult past, stressful presents, and precarious futures, but they also have a host of challenges that previous generations did not face in the same way. And especially this current cohort that is moving through our college system right now have had very disrupted high school experiences, disrupted by a global pandemic, a lockdown. People have missed proms, they have missed forming peer relationships, starting romantic relationships. So many of the social firsts were taken from them. And I think that we're seeing this evidence in our classrooms. Students today are also experiencing higher levels of political polarization and polarization within their families. There's the ongoing battle for racial justice. And the planet is on fire. And so these are stressors that are momentous. And it probably isn't terribly surprising that we're seeing headlines like these. And so on the right, we have from the Chronicle of Higher Education, a stunning level of student disconnection in the classroom. Another recent article called it militant apathy, that students are disengaged, they're not completing assignments, they're not participating, they're not showing up. And we have on the left here an unprecedented move. 3 of the main United States organizations dedicated to youth and adolescent mental health banded together and issued a national state of emergency when it comes to youth and adolescent mental health, a state of emergency. And so students are really struggling in the present moment. And this is probably not news to any of you actively teaching. How are faculty doing? Faculty are struggling as well. And so faculty are facing a lot of those stressors, of course, and then also the burnout of several years of pivoting back and forth, different modalities, all institutions asking more and more of faculty with fewer and fewer resources. And this is one article that claims that faculty aren't going to leave necessarily. We're not going to have a great resignation of faculty the way some businesses have faced, but they're kind of phoning it in. The spark is gone. I actually do believe we need to be wary of a great resignation in higher ed. And so I wrote this article saying as much. Your most important resource is eyeing the door, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. And 3 weeks later, I quit my tenured position. And so I do think it's a risk that as we ask more and more and more of faculty with fewer and fewer resources, that they're going to find other things to do. And they are our most important resource. You are our most important resource. How are staff doing? Maybe staff are okay. The staff are not okay. And so equally, if not more levels, especially in places on campus like the counseling center, like mental health services, residential services, staff are burnt out as well. And so what do we do? With all due respect to the organizers of today, I think what we need is not necessarily mental health webinars, but we need to reduce employee workloads and increase supports. And support for faculty and staff looks like time and money. And so I think that that's really what we need. But what do we do in the meantime while we wait for higher salaries and more course releases? I think that there we can turn a little bit to the science and talk a little bit about what is the science of well-being, what is the science of conquering burnout and ameliorating faculty and student mental health struggles. And I think we could start by asking the question, what do students want or expect in terms of assistance with their mental health? And what I'm going to share with you, and again, this is all linked in the show notes for the PowerPoint slides, is a report from Inside Higher Ed, and they teamed up with College Pulse, which is a survey company that interviews college students. And they asked this question, what do students expect from their institutions in terms of help or assistance with their mental health? And I listened to the webinar, and I also put the link to the webinar that came out of this. And one thing that's not in the report but was in the webinar that I found fascinating is that they shared that students have such high expectations of help with their mental health, and their parents do as well, that this has become such a frequent question on college tours. What are the institution's resources with mental health, that colleges have started building it into the narrative or the script on their college tours. And they actually, Inside Higher Ed, recommended that different campuses, if you're not doing that, to do that. And so this is the level of expectation that parents and students are coming to admissions with. But we're instructors. What do students expect from their professors, from their instructors? And so this first slide is just demonstrating, I don't love the way they depicted the data, but on the left here, we have students saying that they do expect assistance from their instructors. And on the right are the numbers of students saying that easing stress and mental health struggles are only the students' responsibilities. And so you can see here that they do expect their instructors, not just campus counseling, not just residential life, to offer assistance with their mental health. What sorts of help are they interested in? So this first figure is help with stress. Can instructors decrease their stress levels? And interestingly, they're not really interested, it looks like, in some of the solutions that have been proposed by different folks. They're not really interested in seeing stress management resources in the syllabi or talking about stress management in class or mindfulness exercises in class. Rather, they point toward pedagogy. They would like assistance with their stress in the form of being mindful of deadline times and how that might affect student workload and stress, flexibility with deadlines, using lower stakes rather than higher stakes assessments, and offering extra credit. So that's stress. In terms of mental health struggles specifically, they again are not terribly interested in seeing mental health resources in their syllabi. One almost gets the feeling that they don't read these documents. They're not really interested in talking about mental health and available resources in class. Again, where they point to is flexibility for students who might be struggling with mental health. And interestingly, knowing common signs of mental health struggles and connecting them with resources on campus. And we'll talk about that a little bit during the solutions. So that's what students want. What do students need? Because that's might be a different question. And this is where my framing of compassionate challenge comes in, because I think students need both. They need compassion and they need challenge. And compassion has to come first. I love this quote from Karen Costa, and especially in the frame of all those monsters and challenges that we were talking about earlier, resilience isn't pulling yourself up by its bootstraps. Resilience is a natural outgrowth of having support. We get correct care and support, and resilience blooms all on its own. And the idea that student learning and student success is integrally tied up in the connections that they form in campus, the relationships that they make, not just with their instructors, not just with their fellow students, but with mentors and coaches and library staff. This is so well established at this point that I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I link to all of these wonderful books in the notes on the PowerPoint slide. All of them are summarizing decades of literature suggesting that this is the case, that students need care, that they need relationships, and that they need social support. I would add, though, this is my favorite theory that I reviewed in Monsters. This is Wai-Kai Howe's Drive to Thrive theory. And he and his collaborators came up with this theory after studying refugees who had survived either war or natural disaster. They were following these individuals to see who fared well after their trauma and who fared less well. And what they found was that resilience was not, again, predicted by things like personality, individual differences, even emotion regulation strategies. None of that kind of panned out. What predicted resilience and lack of resilience was the degree to which the rhythms and routines of their lives were or were not disrupted. Was their child's schooling disrupted? Were they removed from their relationships with their neighbors? Did they see their social partners? And they summarize this theory in saying that stress resilience is determined by sustaining the fabrics and routines, the interwoven psychosocial and communal activities, procedures, and practices, and structure of everyday life. And you can see his depiction of trajectories of resilience and vulnerability over time. And they, fascinatingly to me, use the metaphor of fabrics and fabric science and material science to explain resiliency. And so fabrics, of course, are made of these interwoven threads. And some fabrics have a lot of threads and they're very complex, and they can survive if you pull a few threads. Other fabrics are more thinly designed, and if you pull one or two threads, then everything will be lost. And everyone, if you pull enough threads, will suddenly come to pieces. And so they use this as a metaphor of resiliency. And I think in higher ed, we can challenge ourselves. How do we build campuses that have many interwoven threads of support for students and many possible places that they can turn? And so students need compassion. They're facing unprecedented challenges and higher rates of working and caretaking. Learning, we know, is a relational. And as we'll talk about a little bit more in solutions, we know the classroom's a collective social setting where emotional contagion can guide motivation. So absolutely believe students need compassion. But I also do believe that students need challenge. And so the other half of compassionate challenge is challenge. And this is a first of our student voices. And I'm going to tell you the story of someone I'll call Hannah. Her name is changed, obviously. And Hannah is a psychology major at an HBCU. And we asked her in the process of our interview about negative emotions and anxiety and learning, and whether she felt that these negative emotions impacted her learning. And she told us the story of a time in her first year. She was taking a research method class in the spring, and the instructor asked her to give a presentation. And she hated presentations all through high school. They made her very, very anxious. And she would get so nervous that she felt that she would do a terrible job. And so she was not thrilled about having to give the presentation. But she put her presentation together and she was giving the presentation and just started getting more and more nervous. And she found that every time she got a little more nervous, she would take a step to face her slides until she was entirely with her back to the class and she froze because she knew that she looked silly and just stopped and her voice was caught in her throat. And her instructor, rather than excusing the rest of the presentation, asking her to sit, gently coaxed her through the rest of the presentation. She told her to take a deep breath. She reminded her of the supportive class atmosphere, that everyone hates presentations. She told her, forget about the slides, just focus on the meaning of what you want to tell your class, the story of your research. And step by step, moment by moment, Hannah finished the presentation. And what she told us is that this entirely changed the next 4 years of college for her. She said, this is a quote from her, yesterday in a class, I volunteered to present my project first. That would never have been me during freshman year. So I would say that, yeah, anxiety has impacted the way I learn. It makes me more engaged. And what I found so compelling about Hannah's story is that she voluntarily went on and told us that this didn't just impact her academics, it also impacted her socially, this one experience. And so another place where she would get very anxious was going to basketball games. She really liked basketball games, but if she was meeting a friend and the friend had arrived first, she would walk in to the gym and just freeze. She would just feel like everyone would just turn and stare at her, and she'd take out her phone and hide behind it. And she said she could hear her heartbeat in her ears. And after this research methods class, she said that she felt more comfortable in large crowds as well, that this one experience, again, forever changed her academic and social experience. And we know from decades of work in psychology that avoidance is the worst thing that we can do when we're afraid of something, especially if it's small fears. And this tends to reinforce the anxiety, and we tend to get more anxious the next time. And we tend to get anxious about smaller and smaller gradations of the same stimulus through a process called generalization. And Lisa Damore, who is a clinical psychologist who has written extensively about mental health in adolescence, she says, tension and turmoil we find are strange creatures. When we shrink from pressure and fear, they just take on new, harrowing proportions. And we also know that how we address anxiety, how we resolve anxiety, is through experiencing small bits of what we're afraid of in the atmosphere of safety. And the safe setting is key. And this seems to be driven by two different neurological processes. One, extinguishing past associations between this specific context and the stimulus, like the classroom, and threat. So kind of breaking that association. And that's called inhibitory learning. But then also safety learning, laying new neural pathways, new association between this context and safety, approaching the warm porch light of your friend's porch. And this is just scientific basis of this. Importantly, I am not arguing that we should all get up and do exposure therapy in the classroom with our students. With very few exceptions, we're not that kind of doctor, right? We're not clinicians, and it would be irresponsible to do exposure therapy in the classroom. But we can do something about safety learning. We can create learning environments that support student mental health and well-being rather than trying to be a clinician. This is my last bit of science before we have a discussion and move on to solution. But well-being is comprised of these things here at the left: regular experience of positive emotions, a sense of meaning and purpose, life satisfaction, and the ability to pursue self-defined goals. And all of these things can be the components of a well-run college class, right? Positive emotions, a sense of meaning and purpose, satisfaction, building of competence, pursuing self-defined goals. And while we're not clinicians and we shouldn't be doing exposure therapy, we do ask students to take certain cognitive risks in an atmosphere of support and safety. And so we are doing a little bit of exposure to vulnerability and risk taking in a safe setting. And so I don't think that we need to do clinical work in the class. I don't think that we need to become mindfulness experts. Again, students didn't express a lot of interest in that sort of thing. I think that we just need to teach really well. And presumably that's something that we all enjoy doing. And so I'd like to give you a moment at the tables to discuss this idea of compassionate challenge and whether you see it at work in your own classrooms. Well, I'm going to give us one more frame because I think it's so consistent, and I love this frame from Zaretta Hammond in her wonderful book, Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. And she argues that our teaching can vary on two major dimensions. First, first, how demanding versus lenient we are. And so this is the challenge dimension, I think. Are we asking a lot of our students? Do we have high expectations? Are we spurring them on to new intellectual heights? Or are we being more passive? Are we being more lenient? Are we not challenging, not demanding? And then we can also, our teaching can vary on how kind of chilly and distant we are versus how warm and encouraging we are. And so there's all sorts of ways that we can teach. She argues and presents quite a lot of evidence that the most effective is going to be in this quadrant called that she calls the warm demander, where you have high expectations, high challenge, high intellectual rigor, but also support, safety, warmth. And she in particular presents evidence that this is globally true for all students, but that minoritized students who are minoritized on the basis of race, ethnicity, LGBTQ status, for these students, first generation students, for these students, the warm demander approach is particularly relevant. And so in the in-person, I'm going to set up this prompt. You can discuss this at the tables, and maybe if one volunteer could use the QR code and post a few things on the Padlet, I will switch screens in a moment and show you the Padlet. And the Padlet has 3 columns. And what I'd like you to discuss just for about 5 to 8 minutes, are there ways where you feel that you have been too distant, inflexible, too focused on like it, all of those kind of elements, the challenge elements, in ways that were detrimental either to you and your workload or your students? Second, have there been ways that you've seen being too lenient, too passive, too flexible, too low expectations that were similarly detrimental? And then third, what are ways that you have or could be more of a warm demander, someone with really high expectations, but also personal warmth? And so the QR code links to the Padlet. And in a moment, I will open that up so we can see your responses. But again, you can discuss, and then maybe one volunteer could put a few of your ideas on the Padlet. And then folks on Zoom, you can just Padlet away.
Right, right. That's what I'm
All right. So thank you so much for what sounded like really great conversation. And I see some information. Hold on, I'm just looking at a message in the chat. Erin, that sounds great. So we see a lot of information showing up on the Padlet, and it looks kind of confirmatory to me that people have seen ways in which being too passive or lenient on the one hand and being too demanding and inflexible on the other hand have both kind of gone awry in different ways. And so on the passivity and leniency side, we see a lot, and I always see a lot on the side about deadlines, right? And late assignments and class attendance, and being really flexible on these policies sometimes spiral out of control in a few different ways, in that being flexible for one set of students tends to spread through the class. Students also tend to get into a place where they have this enormous pile of work toward the end of the semester if there's really, really flexible deadline policies. And then, of course, the instructor has to grade that really large pile of work. And then on the too demanding and inflexible side, we have some people saying some of their penalties used to be really strict, and in terms of how to know how to reach out to students who are not attending, and then kind of the balance of being lenient for a while and then needing to pull back and then moving back and forth like that. And in the warrant demander column, I really love the idea that, and again, I am in full agreement with this, that we need systemic change, that we need ways to be less burdened with workload so that we can connect with students who are struggling. And that is definitely part of the conversation. And whenever I present to administrator audiences, I always advocate for the fact that giving faculty a little bit more time means that they are going to be there for your students in a way that they wouldn't be able to if you restrict their time. And so thank you for that. All right, so I am going to move on to solutions. We already saw some solutions building up in the Padlet, and then I definitely want to leave some time for questions at the end, which I think we're going to try to do with the microphones in the in-person room. Okay. So I have 7 solutions, which sounds like a lot for the time we have left, but a couple of them are just 1 or 2 slides. A few of them are a little more elaborate. But I have 7 compassionate challenge guidelines. This is what compassionate challenge looks like to me in the classroom. So guideline number 1 is, again, compassion, care, support comes first. Building classroom community from the very first day with attention to inclusivity. And so this is a whole body of work that I really focused on in my second book, which is called Hive Mind, that I've long been fascinated by, which is the psychological and neurological ways that we synchronize with each other as human beings, that we are ultra social beings. And so we line up and synchronize our facial expressions. This is my daughter many years ago, probably about 16 to be exact. And she is synchronizing her facial expression with this very, very loose stimulus. We line up our movements, we synchronize our movements. So when we walk together, we tend to fall in step with each other. I'm sure we've all experienced the phenomenon when you spend a lot of time with one person and we start echoing their mannerisms and their frames of speech. And as an emotion researcher, my whole background is in emotion. I am particularly fascinated by how our emotions are contagious or infectious, that they're not bounded by skin, that our emotions spill over from one to another. And this is a video that I just think is kind of fun. And you know what? I'm just going to stop sharing and then reshare and make sure that I'm sharing my sound. Yep. Okay. This is a crowded bar scene, and they're watching the last episode of Game of Thrones. And before you freak out, I had a talk in Virginia last week, and there was someone who was very upset with me. She was like, "Don't spoil the show." She was only halfway through, but I'm not going to really spoil anything of importance. But if you weren't a fan of the show, you might not know that there was a moment a few episodes before the end where the main character, Jon Snow, was parted from his direwolf pet, and he didn't give him a pet when they were parted, and everyone was very mad, and the showrunner said, too much CGI, it was too expensive, we couldn't do it. And then here in the very final episode, his direwolf finally gets his little scritch. And I would argue, this is an anecdote, but that there's emotional contagion going on. So I love that. I do have to note that it's a little bit of misinformation, sadly. Someone called out to me that that is actually photoshopped, and the crowded bar scene are watching sports ball, and that they weren't watching Game of Thrones. But the point about emotional contagion still stands, that we experience higher heights of emotion in crowds, that we can catch each other's emotions. And a classroom is a collective social setting, just like any other social setting. We are a group of human beings gathered together for a period of time, successively over sometimes 7, 14, 15 weeks, working on shared goals together. And whether that class is online, in person, in a lab, this is the case, that we are a collective group setting. And so these processes of emotional contagion are present. And I'm sure anyone who's ever taught a class knows this, right? If you pass back an exam that the students did poorly on, and you just feel the deflation, right, spread through the room, and then you struggle to get motivated to teach the class, our emotions affect our students' emotions affect each other, and their emotions affect us. This is just one representative article. This is in a math classroom, looking at these synchronies, this emotional transmission in the classroom between the teacher and the students, and how closely linked they are, and how closely their engagement is tied to teachers' displayed enthusiasm. This was the clearest result we had from our qualitative interview study. I was working with a consultant who was a sociologist. He was unfamiliar with the pedagogical literature, but he was a qualitative expert, and this was my first qualitative study. And so he was helping me out, and he came to me and he said, "Sarah, I think I'm reading all these interviews, and it seems like the most important thing is how the instructor makes the students feel." And this one quote from a student participant just says it straight out. Basically, whatever the professor is like reflects on the students, and vice versa. If they're feeling one type of way, we're also going to be feeling that way. And I love this quote because, and this was not the only student to do this, they draw a direct line between this feeling, and they use the word synergy, and this happened a lot, synergy, vibe. They would use these words about contagion. And they drew a direct line between feeling this synergy in the classroom and being willing to engage more with the work. So they say there's just this feeling you get in a class where participation is crucial. It's like a synergistic effect. I'm addressing the professor, but at the same time, everyone else in the class. And I'm so much more interested in doing the reading and coming to class prepared and wanting to discuss the material. Whereas this student says, it also depends on the teacher's mood in the morning, I have to say. Fridays are happier than Mondays. So how do we do it? How do we get this synergy, this emotional contagion effect? Partly we just have to display enthusiasm, but partly we can just build it into the structure of the course. And this is probably, I'm going to say this a couple of times, but my favorite resource in the resource guide and in the show notes. This is a whole set of community building activities for both online and in-person classes. It was developed by the scholars at the right, who collectively make up a scholarly group called Equity Unbound. They teamed up with One Higher Ed, who are on the left. And this has slide decks, explainers, videos, all sorts of things for building community in your classroom. Everything from icebreakers for the first day to more innovative ways to do discussions, like breaking up think, pair, share, and getting a little more innovative with teacup approaches and snowball activities. And so ways to really draw out that sense of community in your classroom. So I really, if you check out one resource, this one and then the Chevelle Pitt one I'll share in a moment. I also have some book recommendations. As we're building community, we have to think intentionally about being equity minded and about drawing out all the voices in our classroom. And this goes beyond just being welcoming to all voices, but we need to explicitly think about how we are going to include all of our students. These are two amazing books that are filled with strategies for inclusive teaching. So that's number one, building community from the very first day. Number two is helping students reframe and rethink the role of uncertainty, discomfort, and failure in learning. So helping them think differently about negative emotions and anxiety in the process of learning, how to help them draw on Hannah's experience, for instance. And while I was writing this book on anxiety and mental health, I was also writing a co-authored textbook on motivation. And in particular, writing this chapter on the physiology of motivation. And I was so struck by the commonalities between motivation and what the body and brain are doing during motivated states and what the body and brain are doing during anxiety. And so there's some qualitative and quantitative differences, of course, but both systems arouse the body for action in the context of an anticipated future demand under conditions of uncertainty. And their major difference is the appraisal. Do I have the resources to cope? Am I competent? Can I master this? And we know that intolerance of uncertainty is one of the primary drivers and differentiators in anxiety. And this is just a table from this article, Neurobiological Concomitants of Motivational States. And again, showing the commonalities between the body ready for approach, the body ready for avoidance, and the body ready to expend effort. And there are some subtle variations, but both have a really common physiological basis. And this is my favorite academic article in the whole talk. This is from a group of folks out of Tufts University in Medford, Massachusetts, who are reframing their physics curriculum all around this idea of helping students approach uncertainty, helping students understand that failure and uncertainty is part of learning. And so their article is called "It's Scary, but It's Also Exciting: Evidence of Meta-Effective Learning in Science." And they present the case study of a student they call Myra. And I'm just going to skip this for a moment. Myra is a first-year engineering major in their curriculum and a student in their intro physics class. And she was really struggling. She really was focused on memorizing facts and formulas. She was anxious about getting things wrong on the first try and would freeze up during exams. And they share in the article that they approached her in particular for their case study because she was so obviously uncomfortable during the exams, and they really wanted to assist her. And where they wanted to get her to journey to was this feeling of what they dub epistemic vexation. So epistemic being the search for knowledge and having to do with knowledge, and then vexation, like that in the search for knowledge, we're supposed to get a little uncomfortable. And these are all quotes from super famous people that they built into their article, talking about the process of doing science, that it's the torment of the unknown, but it's somehow pleasurable, that it's finding pleasure in mystery, that it's the angst required to motivate the search. And so they reframed their physics curriculum and worked with Myra to really try to get not just Myra, but the whole curriculum of students to focus on decreasing uncertainty and tolerance. And so they did a lot of things that are probably familiar to you: clickers in class, weekly discussion sections. They gave credit on problem sets for effort, not answers, not correct answers. Correct answers were still required on exams. And they had explicit conversations about emotions, confusion, and uncertainty as the part of the process of doing science. And so moving from this idea that physics is about absolute rights and wrongs, and I should feel anxious when I'm uncertain, to understanding that physics is a process of making sense of the world, which is always going to be slippery and messy, and to not only feel comfortable with about feeling uncertain, but to get to that epistemic fixation, to feel excited about being uncertain. And Myra got there. She said that anxiety kind of disappeared and it was replaced by this feeling like, well, we don't know yet. We can work on it. And if we don't, then we're going to have a question that we're just going to wonder about. And this is probably a whole different talk, but these are words from Lisa D'Amour, again, that clinical psychologist. I think we can also have conversations with our students, with each other, and I think with our children about the fact that uncomfortable and unmanageable are not the same thing, that there are times and things that are unmanageable and we should avoid them, but that discomfort, that uncertainty is just part of the human condition and that we need to work through it. Guideline 3, incorporating a sense of play, or what I like to call improvisational learning. And we know from the animal literature that animals play in order to learn, that just like our classrooms, play is kind of a sandbox of sorts to test out new things. But in harsh conditions, animals abruptly stop play. It is something that is only done in safe settings. And play, I'm fascinated by because the sandbox it's really about training for the unexpected. How do I develop uncertainty tolerance? How do I respond when I'm tackled, when I'm pushed over, when I unexpectedly lose my resources? Animals playing, they alternate status, they alternate being in and out of control. It's all about training for the unexpected, and it's incredibly cognitively demanding. You have to understand each other's mental states. You have to be able to predict what each other are going to do next. You need to adjust your responses on the fly. Play is enormously cognitively demanding. I did a whole workshop with a different faculty group on play, and they identified play in the classroom as low stakes, fun, engaging, cognitive, social, safe, new, competitive, active, clear learning of subject. That freedom to enjoy yourself, to engage without judging yourself, is play. We can play literally. We can do improv in the classroom. This is a paper that did just that and measured students' experience with improv in certain classrooms, and then the control classrooms did not engage in improv, just did social experiences, and found that students engaging in improv promoted divergent thinking, it reduced uncertainty and tolerance, and it elevated affective well-being. Most of us are probably not going to do improv in the class, though you certainly could. What are other ways that we can play? We can play with some of those community building, warm-up activities. We can get up and move. This is probably the thing that has changed most in my last few years of teaching, is the number of ways that I get students up out of their chairs, interacting with other students in different parts of the classroom and moving around. Again, those harsh conditions are going to decrease play, so we can innovate with grading and we can interrupt the routine. I think there's a lot. I can take questions on that later maybe, but just getting outside what you do every day in the class, especially at that like 2/3, 3/4 of the way through the class, kind of throwing everything out the window and doing something new. can be a way to play. And if you're teaching online or blended, there's been so many great developments. One of the unexpected gifts of the pandemic was all the development of all of these tools to really get creative and interesting in online settings. Number 4, challenging but compassionate course structure, which means lower stakes, lots of feedback, and what a lot of people have started calling flexibility with guardrails. I'm going to start there. What is flexibility with guardrails? And I saw this, developing in the Padlet as you were posting things, that you don't want to be completely rigid, but you also don't want to be completely flexible, right? You want to guide students, keep them on track. And so some things that could be flexibility with guidelines, guardrails. In another interview project, I was talking to intro bio faculty, and one of them had the great idea. She had chunked her class into modules already. And so there were like 5 modules over the semester. And she had lots of flexibility within the modules. So deadlines were not terribly strict within the modules, but you had to finish it within the module, so that students were doing that chunk of learning before they moved on to the next, and they needed that scaffolding. So flexibility within limits. Another way that you can have flexibility with limits are tokens for missed or late assignments, but limited tokens, not unlimited. Dropping lowest assignments or assessments can be a way of flexibility with guardrails. Doing something like staged assignments, so it's not the papers due, but drafts are due, or 2-stage exams where students are taking an exam and they earn a certain number of their points, but then have a second stage where they can earn back some of the points that they lost. And so these are all ways that I think that we can have flexibility with guardrails. And I think that this is also a way that we can build those boundaries and kind of set some limits, flexibility with guardrails for ourselves. And Lindsay Maisland, who's a wonderful thinker, we presented together at a conference called Pod. And she's really focused on, yes, let's be amazing teachers. Let's be student-centered. Let's be inclusive. But we also have to take into account both our pedagogical values, because we can't do everything. We can, so what's most important to us, to our values, and our context, our needs, and our boundaries. What security do you have in your position or not? How are identity-based characteristics going to impact how students will respond to various teaching practices? And so we want this sweet spot, she argues, this match between your pedagogical values, your context, needs, and boundaries, and inclusive student-centered teaching. You might be wondering, how do I know what my pedagogical values are? She gives us 2 great values illuminating questions, one kind of for the more pessimists and one for the optimists. And so a question that you could ask yourself is, what are your pedagogical pet peeves? What drives you bananas when you hear someone else is doing something in their classroom? When you're like, oh my God, I can't believe they're doing that. Because that's going to illuminate what your values are. And secondly, the more optimistic version, if someone were to give you a teaching award and they were to nominate you for this teaching award and they wrote a letter, what would you most hope would end up in that letter? What are you most hoping they'd say about your teaching? And so these things can help you identify your pedagogical values. And if something's not consistent with your pedagogical values, don't do it. In terms of grading and guardrails, my favorite resource is this new book that I linked to, Grading for Growth. And this really focuses on feedback. So yes, we can traditionally grade, we can ungrade, which is kind of like throwing traditional grading out the window and doing all portfolios or collaborative grading. But what's really important is that we hit these feedback loops, that marks are indicating progress, that we've clearly defined standards and helpful feedback. And feedback is a focus of an NSF grant that I have for Intro to Biology with these wonderful scholars. And we interviewed tons of intro bio faculty, 297 of them actually. And one of the consistent findings of these of these surveys and interviews was that faculty are most interested in improving their feedback to students. All right, my last few are short. Number 5, have a plan for addressing hot moments. So a student raises their hand and they say something racist. A student emotionally or verbally attacks another student, or emotionally or verbally attacks you. One of these moments that we don't feel prepared for and they happen. And what we don't want to do, which is the most natural thing to do, is freeze up and not really respond or address the moment and just zoom past it without ever returning to it. And the best way, I think, to deal with these hot moments is to have an active plan in place before they happen. And so this is my other favorite resource. This is just a screenshot of 3 of the 10. But Shavella Pittman has given us this amazing resource and made it open in just a blog post. She gives us 10 in the moment responses for addressing micro and macro aggressions in the classroom, literal things that you can just rephrase in your own voice and have in your back pocket so that when these things happen, as they will happen, you know exactly how to redirect the conversation to convey that the moment happened and that it's not appropriate and that you're not just zooming past it and tacitly agreeing with whatever has been said. And so that's an amazing resource she has given us. So hot moments. Number 6 is knowing your campus resources and using them. And again, this is something that students are hoping for from their instructors. And this is going to vary campus to campus what resources there are. But I've listed just some of these, some of the most obvious ones: counseling center, right? Bias reporting is only something on some campuses. Most campuses have someone that you can email if you're just, again, seeing some warning signs, worried about a particular student, that there's a resource you can reach out to and report that. I noted here, I added library and campus health services recently. I was, again, at another talk, and the librarians noted that a lot of times, students are working there, students are studying there, that they are another important part of those fabrics and routines on campus. And then finally, I know this talk was titled Student and Faculty Mental Health, and we've been talking mostly about student mental health. But I think number 7 is truly important: knowing the limits of your role and setting boundaries to protect your own well-being. And we don't have time to go through this in detail, but we know that the science of mental health suggests that mental health and physical health are incredibly tied together. And as much as we academics love to see ourselves as brains on sticks and forget that we have a body, that a key component of mental health is physical health, is sleep, is time with social others to replenish, is anything that you do to add to the physiological resources of your body. And this is going to vary from person to person. I think we all need sleep. We all need pretty good nutrition. But for some folks, there are going to be ways that you add to your balanced body budget that are different than others. For some, it might be exercise. For others, it might be reading fiction. For others, it might be checking in with your closest friend. Prentice Hemphill reminds us, boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. You can only be there for your students if you are well. And so I challenge you to ask yourselves 3 questions this semester. First, and this one just do in your own head, what activities fuel your body budget? What adds to the number of resources you have so that it is full, so that when you need to tax those resources are there? So for you, what activities? Is it sleep? Is it exercise? Is it reading fiction? Is it cooking? So I challenge you to identify and add those. But I'm not naive. I know that adding things means that you have to take away other things. that time is limited and we're all burnt out because there are so many demands. So question number 2, and this, I have a Menti poll. So you can go to menti.com and use that code, or you can use the QR code. What are you going to say no to? So if you're saying yes to more sleep, more exercise, more time with friends, then what are you going to say no to that is currently taking up your time? What is one thing you are going to remove from your schedule or to-do list? I'll give you a moment with the QR code and then I'll open that up. Okay, we have some responses coming in. Okay, we have some responses. So we have Amazon that it takes time. Worrying about a clean house, right? Like taking some of the perfectionism off the table. Unnecessary presentations. I'm sorry to the person who has to keep plugging along until May. I hope that you're able to carve some time. Maybe someone else's idea. You say, oh, I could say no to that. Feeling guilty about buying lunch at work. Great. Time is money and money is time. And if buying lunch takes a lot of time off of your table, it gives you back some more time to sleep, to read, then why not? Worrying about small details, things that don't positively impact. I think we're seeing a lot of committee. This is a very common response I see on a lot of campuses. Extra committee work, more committee work, chairing committees. One thing that I have definitely started saying no to is reviewing other people's articles. I know that the whole academic publishing industry is breaking down a little bit because I'm not the only one who's saying no, but it's just gotta happen. So thank you for that. And I hope that you do say no. The third question is, what would you enjoy? So this is a little bit like Lindsay Maislin's pedagogical values, but a little more focused on happiness and joy and well-being. What articles do you want to read? What current controversies in your field do you want to discuss? And even what would you like to grade? And I know that seems a little bit of a misnomer, but this image is from my colleague at my previous institution, Carolina Fujikova, and she was working with our center during the online pivot, original online pivot during the pandemic. And she teaches a class in plant biology. She's a botanist. And she had students do this plant identification paper where they would just choose a plant, write up, what does the plant do? Like, I'm not a biologist. All the different questions that were in the plant ID. But then she had this idea during the pandemic and the switch, because students had scattered all over the country back to their places. And she realized that they probably were reporting back from very different climates. And so she turned it into a video assignment where they had to go out into somewhere near their home and find a plant and do the plant ID over video on Flipgrid. And she said she'd never had so much fun grading because she loves plants. She's a botanist, and she just got to watch all these videos of all these beautiful plants from all over the country. And so I think that this lens, what will you enjoy, and using that to structure your syllabus, again, is going to yield more enthusiasm, energy, and have positive impacts on the students as well. So it's setting a boundary, but also is good pedagogical practice. So I'm going to end on this quote from Tracy Dennis Tiwari, who's a clinical psychologist who wrote this book very recently, Future Tense. And it's actually elaborating on that whole idea that motivation and anxiety share a lot psychologically, neurobiologically, biologically, and that we can reframe our anxiety. And she says, hope, ambition, and drive live in that space between the present and the uncertain future. So when we engage with our anxiety, we can also leverage all the possibilities of the future. And so I thank you, and I'll open up for questions in a moment, but I encourage you to keep the conversation going. I'm pretty out there on the internet. I have my Blue Sky there. I've moved there from Twitter, my Instagram. I have a Substack newsletter, Once More with Feeling. I have copies of my books up there, and I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to, have you tap my shoulder at a conference in the future. And I thank you for sharing your ideas with me here. So I'm going to stop share, and I think we're going to take questions out loud. Certainly people on Zoom can post right in the chat and I'll read them out loud for the in-person folks. So thank you.
All right, we've got a wireless mic. Anyone have a question for our speaker?
I don't bite. Oh, I can't.
Good morning.
Oh, okay, perfect. Hi.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi.
Can you
I
hear
can
me?
now. Yep.
Am I the only one that doesn't know what a token is for a missed early assignment?
Oh, yep.
What is a token? What is a token?
It really is more of a I think we used to have in psychology and reinforcement schedules, like reward schedules, like actual tokens, like a little doohickey. But in a class, what it means is just that there's a limited number, so a limited number of passes. So in my motivation and emotion class, for instance, students, I have 5 homework opportunities, and students have to complete 3 of them. And so they sort of have a token to 2 passes. You could also think about it as like a get out of jail free card or a pass, so that a certain number of assignments can either be late or dropped, or students don't have to complete them at all. And so you're building in some flexibility. If students get COVID, if they have 3 midterm exams in a week, they can just opt out of a particular assignment.
Thank you so much for your great presentation. You'd mentioned in that you have found new and creative ways of getting students moving in your class. Would you be able to give just a couple examples
sure.
of some newer things you're trying or
Sure.
have had success with, I guess? Thank you.
Absolutely. So a couple things that I've tried to good effect that I didn't invent, I just stole from other people. One of them is a snowball discussion technique. And so it's sort of like a traditional think, pair, share, except that students originally pair with a partner near them and discuss one level of the prompt. And then they have to get up as a pair and cross to another part of the classroom and find another pair. And then they discuss as a group of 4, either a second, like more deep discussion prompt, or they compare and contrast what they have discussed. And so that's a snowball, and I like that. Another thing I kind of have taken from my executive director of my teaching center, she does a lot in our workshops with those big sticky notes. They're like giant Post-its. And I have found those work really well with students. And so I'll put the giant Post-its around the room and bring some markers. And I'll often have students count off and go to the different posters by that way, so that that mixes up who's talking to whom and like builds more cross community across the whole class. And so they'll write on the post-its, you know, their responses to the discussion questions, and then sometimes I'll say, okay, switch, and they'll move because the different post-its have different discussion points on them. And those are some ways. And there's a lot of different things you can do with the posters. But students really, they you can tell they're a little grumbly at first because they're tired, and I get it. When I go to workshops and the facilitator's like, all right, get up, I'm like, but once they're up and they have the pretty markers and they're writing on the board, the energy in the room really rises quite a bit, I find.
I think we might have time for one more question.
Hi, writing, and I do a lot of icebreakers and unconventional classroom, and I'm wondering if you could speak to you with the unconventional activities, like a student who can't back from a student who said, I do not benefit. So like there's and so that, you know, there's like diverse neuro component also, and so just with types of activities, how do you, just account for the
Yeah. So, couple different things. One is that I really try, and this is not just with kind of unconventional and icebreaker activities, but a lot of my teaching practices to be very transparent about why I am choosing them. And so I did a whole in a brain and behavior class. I did what's called a jigsaw approach to a lot of our class material, where the students would each learn a piece on their own and then peer teach each other a piece of the material, and then they would present to the larger class, and they absolutely hated it. And I got really burned on my course evaluations that semester. They're like, why don't you teach? You know, you should be the one teaching. And I dialed back on it a little bit, but I refused to get rid of it completely because I really thought it was valuable. But the following semester, I told them that the previous class hated it. And so again, I warned them that they were going to hate it. And then I did a mini presentation from like cognitive psychology about why I'm doing this, and about the illusion of fluency, and that you don't really learn. It feels like you're learning when you just hear the pretty story from the instructor, but you don't, and that you need to like kind of butt your head against it. And all of the different aspects of why I was doing it this certain way. And that seemed to really help. And so I do that with the icebreakers as well. I always tell students, kind of part of the Mind Over Monsters book is also part memoir about my own panic disorder, and the fact that I never did any of these sorts of things in class. I never talked in class. I hated it. And my experiences that were a lot similar to Hannah in terms of working through my panic disorder. And so I know what it feels like to be sitting there and being like, oh my God, can we not do this? But that it is, again, the part of learning. It is good for learning, and it's also good emotionally. So transparency is part of it. And then also mixing it up. So I really try to be sure that that we don't always do really extroverted social activities, that there's a lot of like reflection in the notebooks and quiet time, and sort of self-reflection, or online. I use Menti and a number of other online things so that students can contribute on their phones, and all of that builds into their engagement grade. And so students who are not comfortable talking in front of the entire class do not have to regularly, that there are other ways to engage with the course. And so transparency, and then variety, and making sure that there are many ways that students can interact with the course material. But great question.
All right, if we want to one more time, please.
Thank you.